What if the deadliest weapon in history was smaller than a grain of sand? The year is 1338. In a remote village near Lake Issyk-Kul, in the mountains of what is now Kyrgyzstan, a gravedigger carves an inscription on a tombstone. The words are simple. They say only this: died of pestilence. He does not know that in 9 years, this same pestilence will kill half the known world. This is not a story about a disease. This is a story about how civilization almost ended, how connection became catastrophe, how a bacterium riding on the back of a flea rewrote the course of human history. This is the story of the Black Death. Before the plague, Europe was thriving. The great famines of the early 1300s had faded from memory. Fields were green with wheat, cities hummed with commerce. The population had reached 75 million, the highest in history. The Silk Road stretched like a golden thread from Venice to Beijing. Merchants traveled for months along its dusty paths, carrying silk and spices, porcelain and precious stones. Genoese traders had established outposts on the Black Sea. Venetian galleys dominated Mediterranean shipping. Money flowed. Wealth accumulated. The medieval world believed it was entering an age of endless prosperity. Medicine, too, seemed advanced. Physicians trained in the great universities of Bologna and Paris. They read Galen and Hippocrates, ancient masters whose wisdom had endured for over 1,000 years. Disease, they taught, came from imbalanced humors. Bad air caused sickness. The cure was bloodletting, purging, and prayer. The church stood at the center of everything. Cathedrals rose toward heaven. Monasteries preserved knowledge. Priests guided souls from cradle to grave. God watched over his creation. Everything had meaning. Everything had purpose. Everything made sense. No one imagined that the very roads connecting their world would become highways for extinction. No one suspected that the ships bringing silk and spices also carried invisible death. No one understood that beneath the floorboards of caravans, in the fur of rats, in the bellies of fleas, something ancient was stirring. In 2022, researchers at the Max Planck Institute published a breakthrough discovery in the journal Nature. By extracting DNA from teeth found in medieval graves near Lake Issyk-Kul, they identified the exact strain of Yersinia pestis that would become the Black Death. The tombstones marking these graves, dated 1338 and 1339, recorded an unusual spike in deaths. The inscriptions mentioned pestilence. 700 years later, science confirmed what those gravediggers had witnessed. This was ground zero. The bacterium had lived for centuries in the bodies of marmots, large rodents that burrow in the Central Asian steppes. Hunters trapped marmots for their fur. Fleas jumped from marmot to human. And then, through trade routes that connected east to west, the infection began its long journey toward Europe. In the city of Siena, a man named Agnolo di Tura worked as a chronicler, recording the events of his time for future generations. He had a wife named Nicoluccia. They had 5 children. Their lives were ordinary, comfortable, safe. Agnolo was 42 years old when the plague arrived in his city in May of 1348. He watched his neighbors sicken and die. He saw the black swellings appear on their bodies, the fever that burned through them in days. He saw the mass graves fill faster than workers could dig them. Then it came for his family. First, Nicoluccia fell ill. Then his children, one by one. The youngest was 8, the oldest was 15. Agnolo could do nothing but watch them die. In his chronicle, he wrote words that still echo across 7 centuries. So many died, he recorded, that all believed it was the end of the world. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands. No bells tolled. Nobody wept. Everyone expected death. While Agnolo mourned in Siena, across the Mediterranean, a physician named Ibn al-Khatib observed the plague's devastation in Granada. He was one of the few who questioned the prevailing medical wisdom. He noticed something his colleagues refused to accept. The disease spread from person to person. Those who had contact with the sick became sick themselves. Those who stayed away survived. Ibn al-Khatib wrote that experience, research, and evidence proved contagion was real. It was a radical idea. It contradicted the teachings of ancient masters. It challenged the belief that disease came from bad air or divine punishment. For his observations, he would eventually be accused of heresy. But he was right. If you're finding this as gripping as I am, subscribe. We're covering history's deadliest pandemics every week. Before the plague reached Europe, it passed through a crucible of war. In 1346, a Mongol army under the command of Janibeg Khan laid siege to the city of Caffa on the Crimean coast. Caffa was a Genoese trading colony, a vital link in the chain connecting east and west. The Mongols had besieged it before, in 1343 and 1344. Each time, they failed to breach its walls. This siege would be different. The plague struck the Mongol camp with devastating force. Soldiers began dying by the thousands. The Italian notary Gabriele de Mussi, writing from accounts of survivors, described what happened next. The dying Mongols, he wrote, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster, realized they had no hope of escape. They lost interest in the siege, but before they retreated, they found a way to share their suffering. They ordered the corpses of plague victims to be loaded onto catapults. Then they hurled them over the walls of Caffa. De Mussi recorded that what seemed like mountains of dead were thrown into the city. The defenders could not hide or flee or escape from them. They dumped as many bodies as they could into the sea, but the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water. The stench was overwhelming. The infection spread. Modern historians debate whether this act of biological warfare actually transmitted the plague, or whether rats and fleas would have carried it into the city regardless. But the image remains seared into history. The first documented use of disease as a weapon, corpses sailing through the air, death delivered by catapult. When the Mongols finally withdrew, the survivors of Caffa fled by ship. Some sailed for Genoa, others headed for Venice, others for Constantinople. They carried the infection with them, and from the ports where they landed, the plague radiated outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Constantinople fell first among the great cities. The Byzantine capital, with its 500,000 inhabitants, watched helplessly as the plague swept through its crowded streets. The emperor lost his son. The patriarch of the Orthodox Church tried to organize religious processions to appease God's wrath. The processions only spread the infection faster. People gathered shoulder to shoulder, breathing the same air, sharing the same prayers. Faith became a vector. From Constantinople, the disease radiated outward. Ships sailing to Alexandria brought it to Egypt. Vessels heading west carried it to Sicily, then to the Italian mainland. Each port became a new point of infection. Each infected city sent out more ships, more travelers, more death. The physicians of the time struggled to understand what was happening. In Avignon, seat of the papal court, a surgeon named Guy de Chauliac observed the outbreak with clinical precision. He noted two forms of the disease. The first caused swellings in the groin and armpits, killing victims within 5 days. The second attacked the lungs, spreading through coughs and breath, killing within 3. De Chauliac tried every remedy known to medieval medicine. He lanced the buboes to drain the poison. He prescribed theriac, an ancient compound of dozens of ingredients, including opium and viper flesh. He bled patients to restore their humoral balance. Nothing worked. The physician himself caught the plague. Against all odds, he survived. But he recorded that so contagious was the disease that people caught it from simply looking at the afflicted. This was not true, but it captured the terror of a world that could not comprehend how death was spreading. In Florence, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio witnessed the collapse of civilization. Bodies lay in the streets because there was no one to carry them away. Houses stood empty, their owners fled or dead. The stench of decay hung over everything. Some Florentines abandoned the city for country estates. Others locked themselves in their homes, refusing contact with anyone. Some gathered in groups, believing that eating well, drinking fine wine, and enjoying music would ward off the disease. They died anyway. Still others turned to God with desperate fervor. They filled the churches, praying for mercy. But the churches became death traps. People packed together in confined spaces, breathing the same air. Priests who heard confessions caught the plague from the dying. So many clergy perished that the Pope granted remission of sins to anyone who died without receiving last rites, because there were simply no priests left to administer them. As the plague spread, a strange movement emerged from the chaos. They called themselves the Brotherhood of the Cross. History remembers them as the Flagellants. They appeared first in Germany in late 1348. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds strong, sometimes thousands, marched from town to town wearing white robes marked with red crosses. They carried whips with 3 leather tails, each tail knotted, some embedded with iron spikes. Twice a day, they would gather in public squares and cathedrals. They would strip to the waist, and then they would beat themselves until blood ran down their backs. Sir Robert of Avesbury witnessed over 600 flagellants arrive in London in the autumn of 1349. He described how they marched in procession, chanting in their native tongues. 4 would sing, 4 would respond. Then they would throw themselves to the ground in the shape of a cross. One by one, each man would step over the others, delivering a lash to the person beneath him. The flagellants believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could appease divine wrath and end the pestilence. They believed they were saving the world. The Church condemned them. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull in October 1349, declaring the movement heretical. But for many common people, the flagellants represented hope when the Church had failed. Priests were dying, prayers were not working. At least the flagellants were doing something. Yet the movement carried darkness within it. As the flagellants traveled, they spread not salvation, but hatred. They pointed fingers at those they blamed for the plague, and across Europe, that blame fell most heavily on the Jews. Rumors spread that Jews had poisoned the wells, that they had manufactured a deadly powder from spiders, frogs, and the hearts of Christians, that they had conspired to destroy Christendom. None of it was true. Jews were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. But truth was no defense against terror. In September 1348, Jews in the town of Chalon, near Lake Geneva, were arrested and tortured until they confessed to poisoning wells. The confessions, extracted under agony, spread across Europe. In town after town, massacres followed. In Strasbourg, on the 14th of February, 1349, the city council tried to protect its Jewish population. They were overruled. The mayor and council members who defended the Jews were removed from office. On that day, which would later become known as Valentine's Day, nearly 2,000 Jews were taken to the Jewish cemetery and burned alive. Those who agreed to convert were spared. Their children were forcibly baptized. Their property was divided among the citizens. The Strasbourg massacre was not unique. Similar atrocities occurred in Basel, Freiburg, Cologne, and hundreds of other towns. Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull declaring that Jews were not responsible for the plague, that anyone who blamed them had been seduced by the devil. His words had little effect. By the time the first wave of plague subsided, over 200 Jewish communities in Europe had been destroyed. The city of Milan took a different approach to the plague itself. When the first cases appeared, authorities ordered the immediate sealing of any house where sickness was found. Infected families were walled inside with their sick, left to die or recover on their own. The healthy could not leave. The dead could not be removed until the plague had run its course within those walls. This was brutal. It was inhumane. It may also have worked. Milan suffered lower mortality than other Italian cities. The harshness of isolation saved lives, though no one at the time understood why. Venice, the great maritime republic, developed more sophisticated measures. Officials required ships arriving from plague areas to anchor offshore for 40 days before passengers could disembark. This waiting period, called quarantina, from the Italian word for 40, gave its name to a practice we still use today. Quarantine was born in the shadow of the Black Death. By the summer of 1348, the plague had crossed the Alps into France. Marseille fell in January, Paris followed by summer. The disease killed rich and poor without distinction. When it reached Bordeaux, it claimed an unlikely victim. Princess Joan of England was 14 years old, daughter of King Edward III. She was traveling to Spain to marry Prince Pedro of Castile, a union meant to seal an alliance between two kingdoms. When plague broke out in Bordeaux, her guardians moved her to a small village nearby, hoping to escape the infection. It found her anyway. On September 2nd, 1348, the princess died. Her father wrote to the King of Castile with the news. No wedding would take place. No alliance would be formed. The plague had reshaped the politics of nations. In England, the disease arrived at the port of Melcombe Regis in August 1348. By November, it reached London. A chronicler recorded that the pestilence grew so strong that men and women dropped dead in the streets. The City of London purchased land for emergency burial grounds. At East Smithfield, workers dug trenches and filled them with bodies, layer upon layer. Modern archaeologists excavating this site have found over 2,000 skeletons, testament to the scale of death in a single city in a single year. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. The plague arrived. It exploded through the population. It killed between 30 and 60% of inhabitants. Then it moved on, leaving devastation in its wake. Entire villages vanished. In England alone, historians estimate that over 3,000 settlements were abandoned during and after the plague years. Some were completely erased from maps. Fields returned to forest. Churches crumbled. The names of these places survive only in old documents, memories of communities that death deleted from the world. By 1350, the first wave had largely subsided. Europe was unrecognizable. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. Historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide. In Europe, the population fell from roughly 75 million to perhaps 30 million, half a continent, gone in 4 years. The silence that followed was profound. Fields lay unharvested. Workshops stood empty. Ships rotted in harbors. The survivors emerged into a world transformed beyond recognition. And then something unexpected happened. The catastrophic loss of life created something that had not existed before, a labor shortage. For centuries, peasants had been bound to the land. Lords commanded, serfs obeyed. There were always more workers than work. This was the foundation of feudal society. The plague shattered this equation overnight. Suddenly, there were not enough hands to harvest wheat, tend livestock, or work the forges. Lords who had commanded dozens of laborers now struggled to find anyone at all. And the survivors, for the first time in their lives, realized they had power. Peasants began demanding wages. They refused to work for lords who would not pay fair prices. They left cruel masters and sought better ones. A chronicler complained that workers demanded triple the wages they had earned before. Some nobles, he wrote with horror, were forced to work their own fields. The English Parliament tried to stop this revolution. In 1351, they passed the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and forbid workers from leaving their villages. It was useless. There were simply not enough people to enforce the law, and not enough workers to make the old system function. Wages rose, rents fell. Peasants could afford better food, better housing, small luxuries that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The rigid hierarchies of feudalism began to crack. The seeds of a new social order were planted in soil enriched by the bodies of the dead. In 1381, English peasants rose in open revolt, demanding an end to serfdom and fairer treatment. The peasants' revolt was crushed, its leaders executed. But the underlying transformation could not be stopped. Within a century, serfdom in England had effectively ended. Modern research has revealed something even more remarkable. The plague did not just change society, it may have changed humanity itself. In 2022, researchers published a study in Nature examining DNA from plague victims and survivors. They found evidence that certain genetic variants affecting the immune system became significantly more common in European populations after the Black Death. People whose ancestors survived may carry genetic advantages that help them resist infection. The plague killed so many so quickly that it created intense natural selection pressure. Those with certain immune genes were more likely to survive and have children. Their descendants inherited these protective variants. The Black Death did not just kill people, it shaped the human genome. Today, the strain of Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Death still exists. It is the ancestor of most modern plague strains found around the world. The disease still infects several hundred people each year, in places from Madagascar to the American Southwest. But we have antibiotics now. We understand how plague spreads. What killed half the world in the 14th century is now treatable with common medications. If you visit Siena today, you can walk the same streets that Agnolo di Tura walked 7 centuries ago. The great cathedral still stands, though construction stopped during the plague years and was never completed on its original, ambitious scale. The city thrives. Life continues. The Black Death taught humanity lessons we are still learning. It showed that connection, the networks of trade and travel that bind the world together, carries risk as well as reward. It demonstrated that our greatest strengths can become our greatest vulnerabilities. It proved that systems we believe are permanent can collapse in months. But it also revealed something darker about human nature. In times of crisis, fear can turn neighbor against neighbor. Blame can fall on the innocent. The search for scapegoats can lead to atrocities that echo across centuries. And yet, humanity endured. After the worst disaster in recorded history, humans did not give up. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and rebuilt. The world that emerged from the plague was different from the one that preceded it. Labor had value, common people had power. The Renaissance, with its explosion of art and learning and human potential, rose from the ashes of medieval civilization. In 2020, when another pandemic swept the globe, we saw echoes of the 14th century: fear and denial, scapegoating and conspiracy, communities dividing between those who fled and those who stayed. The same patterns, repeated across 700 years. But we also had something the medieval world lacked. We had science. We had public health systems. We had vaccines developed in months rather than centuries. We had learned. The Black Death did not end humanity. It transformed it. From catastrophic loss came unexpected gain. From the death of millions came new rights for survivors. From the collapse of old systems came the birth of new ones. Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands. He did not know that his chronicle would survive 700 years. He did not know that scientists would one day extract DNA from medieval bones to reconstruct the genome of the bacterium that killed his family. He knew only grief and the strange duty to record what he had witnessed so that future generations would remember. We remember. We remember the dead. We remember the survivors. We remember that pandemics will come again, as they always have, as they always will. And we remember that from the darkest moments, something new can emerge, not despite the catastrophe, but because of it. The world breaks, the world changes, the world rebuilds. In the ruins, we find the seeds of what comes next.